Okay, so welcome everyone to the Grad Slam info session. Getting started with Grad Slam for 2022. My name is David Blancha, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Grad Pathways Institute for Professional Development. Today, I'm going to be kind of outlining the basic structure and expectations for participation in Grad Slam, as well as some advice on how to approach the competition and how to prepare yourself. And I'll be leaving plenty of time for questions, which you can ask either by, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in, ask in chat, or save them for the end when we'll have more time. So what is Grad Slam? Grad Slam is an annual contest to communicate research. If you're familiar with similar short form research communication contests in other universities and other systems, you might be familiar with something called a 3MT or a 3-minute thesis. And the idea of Grad Slam is that graduate students from across the UC system will be competing to describe their research in exactly 3 minutes in a way that's accessible and engaging to the public at large, rather than just to other scientists, scholars, and researchers in their fields. And the way this is structured is that you start the competition here at UC Davis in the qualifying rounds, which will be February, and then there will be a cut to the top 10 for the UC Davis final in April, and then the winner of the UC Davis final round will move on to the UC-wide competition, where finalists from all 10 campuses will compete in early May. And because we live in quite interesting times, Grad Slam this year is going to start with a video-based qualifying round. So all master's and PhD students can participate and will be recording their own 3-minute talk on video and then submitting that before the cut to the top 10. So then those videos will be reviewed by the judges, and the top 10 will advance to the final round, which will be an in-person event. And there will be cash prizes for those finalists to compete for, as well as the slot in the UC-wide competition, which will also, currently plan to be in person to compete against other UC finalists. And so the structure of Grad Slam is a competition, and one of the main incentives certainly is the prize money and the visibility that comes with it. But at its core, Grad Slam is really about an opportunity to build kind of a unique and important skill that's going to pay off for you in basically any profession, any job interview setting, anything that you plan to do after leaving UC Davis. Because one of the unfortunate side effects of becoming a deep specialist in your subject area is that you start taking kind of communicative shortcuts the more you're only exposed to people who already have the same basis of knowledge that you do. So being able to explain to people exactly what you're doing, and more than that, to explain why what you're working on is important and why it matters, is going to be really valuable when you leave UC Davis, no matter where your career takes you. All right, so rules for Grad Slam. First of all, to be eligible, you need to be a currently enrolled master's or PhD student, or EDD student, any doctoral graduate program to compete in Grad Slam. Graduate students from the professional schools are also eligible. If you have participated before, you can absolutely compete again. In fact, I think a fair number of our finalists each year are represented by people who were competitors or even finalists in years past. The only person who cannot compete again is the winner of the UC-wide competition from previous years. And then as far as the subject of your talk, the research that you present must be related to your research at UC Davis, but you don't have to, claim sole intellectual ownership of anything you talk about. If you're doing collaborative research, you want to specify what your individual contribution to the research is, but that doesn't prevent you from sharing other aspects of the research for context. Or making that clear, especially if you're, earlier in the life of your research project, you might want to give a talk that provides more context outside of what you've personally done in order to best convey what it is that you are working on as an individual. As far as visuals, one PowerPoint slide is allowed, but it is optional. And I really want to stress that it's optional. Some of the best talks we've seen have been done without a slide. Prezi and other presentation formats are not allowed, and you cannot have animation on your slide. And so this is, one relatively static image. Embedded audio or video aren't permitted unless they're deemed kind of indispensable to the communication of your topic. And so basically, if your slide has, I would say, any noises or movement whatsoever, then you need to get in touch with the Grad Slam committee. We'll be sharing how to contact us at the end for approval beforehand. Okay, I would say this is definitely a case of like, ask for permission, don't wait and ask for forgiveness later. And for the in-person competition, props are allowed, but they need to be cleared again by the organizing committee to make sure that they, basically won't disrupt the flow of the event, don't require excessive cleanup, aren't hazardous or dangerous in any way, and things like that. I mentioned that this is a 3-minute talk, and this is a very strict feature of the competition. So as soon as you start talking, we time you, and points are deducted from your final score if you go over time. You'll notice there's no penalty for being under time, and especially for the qualifying round, since you're recording yourself and you can record yourself as many times as it takes, I would say there's no reason to be over time and to face a deduction there. So your video can be recorded using any software, any program or equipment that you choose to use, but the submission itself, we need a consistent video format. So make sure whatever you're using that you're set to capture the video in MP4 format. The 3-minute video must be continuous, so no editing or cutting your video together. And it must be a single unedited take. So you can't use editing software to modify any part of the video except for start and end times. You can obviously cut the video to the chunk that is your actual talk. You should save your video submission and your PowerPoint slide as last name, first name, and upload the files by a minute before midnight on February 11th. To be considered an entrant in the qualifying round. Judging during the qualifying round will be from a panel of faculty members and staff members who have volunteered to be judges. So they'll be selected to ensure disciplinary diversity, and we try as much as possible to avoid conflicts of interest. So if you're a faculty advisor, volunteers to be a judge, they will not be judging your video. So note for the judging criteria, even though I'm going to give you tips a little later on how to improve your video quality, just for like the passive impact it has on an audience, that your video quality is not a main criteria for judging. Okay, it focuses on your presentation and your ability to communicate, and the fact that it is a video. Again, we're not judging you on video production. This is just a medium we're using to get your talk in front of judges. And so you will be scored on, number one, clarity. So did you provide adequate background to make the talk and the importance of your work understandable? Number two, could they follow it? Was it easy to follow? Was it clear and logical? Did it make sense how your talk was laid out? Delivery, so this would be, pace, enthusiasm, vocal range, engagement. One way I would think about this is, was the talk pleasant to listen to? Okay, because it could otherwise be distracting. Visuals, if you do include in a visual, you will be judged on whether or not the visual actually enhances the presentation and emphasizes the primary points of the talk. Is the slide well designed, clear, legible, and concise? In a lot of ways, I would say, was the visual necessary? So if your visual is just a giant block of static text repeating things that you're saying verbally, that's not going to enhance your talk the way an illustrative diagram or image would. And then appropriateness, this is a measure of whether or not the topic and its significance was appropriate for non-specialists. Okay, so was your talk communicated in a way that made sense to people who aren't already working in your field? Were you able to avoid jargon that is hard for people to follow? Were you able to use analogies that have, broad appeal that help people understand, a process or phenomenon in your research without having, that deep specific knowledge that you have? And then intellectual significance. Did you explain why your project matters? Okay, and if you're, collaborating with others, did you explain why your individual contribution matters? And what I really want to stress here is that intellectual significance is not the same as having, necessarily wide sweeping implications for, the survival of the human species or anything like that. It's about knowing, clearly communicating why the work you're doing matters to the people that it matters to. Okay, so some of you are out there curing cancer, and that's fantastic. That can be explained why that matters to anyone who knows someone with cancer or who might contract it themselves. But others are doing a deep dive in obscure area of literature or history, and you can still get full marks for intellectual significance there if you can explain why that research matters to the people who care about it. And then finally, there's a criterion on engagement. So to what extent did you spark the audience's intellectual curiosity? Did you make them want to learn more about what you're doing? And this is kind of a twofold criterion. On one hand, you're giving a very short talk. There's clearly much more you could say. So did you give your talk in a way that makes your audience want to hear the rest about your work? And additionally, you are working, your work is incomplete, right? You're a currently enrolled student, your research is ongoing. So were you able to convey to the audience why you also still want to learn, why you want to build that kind of body of knowledge for all of us, and why that's interesting and exciting? All right, so I'm going to take a quick pause here and pull up chat if anyone has any questions on kind of the structure, rules, regulations, and judging of the Grad Slam competition.
Just a quick question, if I could do so verbally.
Please go ahead.
In terms of being at a relatively earlier stage of the research process, will there be any judging criteria that is sort of determined based on the initial data or conclusions you may have, or is it more about just how you frame wherever the stages that you happen to be?
Excellent, thank you. Great question. So you will not be judged kind of on the, let's say, like the quality or the prospects of your initial findings or initial data. It's really just about your ability to communicate whatever significance they do have. So I would say that the important thing there, if you're earlier in your work, is to clearly articulate what your initial findings kind of suggest. Like what does it make you want to look into more, and what hypothesis or what direction are those initial findings pointing you towards?
Great, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, Winnie.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the overview. I have a question about the due date of the video. I think I noted in your slide that it's the 11th of February. And so it's a couple of days before what is noted on the website. So I'm just wondering which one we should be going by.
Oh, my apologies on that. The website is the final word. So if there's a mismatch there, that's that's my fault for making an error on the slide.
Oh, thank you for the clarification.
Yes, thank you for asking, and thank you for bringing everyone's attention to that if I did make that mistake. We've also got a question in chat. Are we able to gesture to particular portions of our visuals, like with laser pointers? So this is something that for the live competition, I would, this is a question I would email into our team with the contact that I'll share at the end of this presentation. In the video, you will not realistically be able to gesture to parts of your visual. Oh, thank you. Catherine is in chat also. Sorry, I'm jumping around, correcting me. Yeah, qualifying round videos are due February 16th. Apologies for that mistake. Yeah, as far as gesturing to particular portions of your visuals, I would say no during the video. That's not likely to be something you can do very effectively, unless you find like a creative way of doing that. I don't want to kind of forestall that. I would say my advice is that using like the laser pointer function in Zoom is not very effective. And also, as I'm going to be talking about with some tips for your visuals, if your visual is so complex that you need to gesture visually to part of it, rather than being able to like mention and name the section that you're looking at, your visual is probably more complex than ideal. All right, so at this point, I want to move on to some tips and advice for the competition. Basically, kind of small things you can do to, I would say, dramatically improve your success. These are kind of the, in the past, these have been kind of like the most obvious differentiators from some of the weaker talks and the strongest talks. And so to get here, I want to start by sharing a video of a previous winner, Katie Murphy, who won the UC-wide competition in 2019.
Let's see, by a show of hands, how many of you are looking forward to our lunch today? All right, now keep your hand up if you'd like to be able to eat lunch in 20 years. Okay, that's gonna be 1, 2, let's say just about everybody. My name is Katie Murphy, or as my students call me, the Corn Queen. And I'm working to ensure food for our future. The unfortunate reality is that 20 years from now, we expect 2 billion more people on this planet. That is 2 billion more mouths to feed. Given our current production levels, we simply cannot produce enough food. Lunch in the future could be a luxury. Now, my graduate research at UC Davis is working to solve this problem. How do we grow more food using less resources? We stop losing crops to plant disease. Just like humans, plants get sick, and when they do, our food dies in the field and never makes it to your plate. Now, the nasty, moldy ear of corn that you see up here is caused by a fungal disease. Fungus causes 10% crop loss of corn every year. Now, if we're not having a nice buttery ear of corn for lunch, I can guarantee you that we're eating something that was made with a corn byproduct, or we're eating something that has eaten corn. It is the backbone of the American food supply. What a 10% crop loss looks like is a cornfield that covers the entire state of Florida, rendered totally inedible. If we can rescue some of this crop from disease, we can grow more food. Now, my graduate research has uncovered a new group of chemicals that corn makes in response to this disease. Here, corn is acting as its own doctor, sensing that it's under attack, diagnosing itself with disease, and producing its own medicines, antibiotics really, to fight off this fungus. Interestingly, we've only ever seen these chemicals in corn, not in any other plant. We now know the structure of these chemicals, the genes that control their production, and how they're working as antibiotics to fight off disease. I did so by taking the genes from corn and putting them into a bacteria that I can grow in the lab in order to make these chemicals and figure out what they do. Now that I have this knowledge of these naturally produced plant antibiotics, we can begin to reduce crop loss due to disease. Now, they do call me the corn queen, but I love all plants. And so using genetics and breeding, we can make corn varieties and other crops that can make their own medicines. This will reduce our current pesticide use, grow us more food, and generate stronger plants to ensure food for the future. Thank you.
All right, so I'm sure many of you noticed in the 2019 competition, competitors were allowed 3 slides. But I think this is all 3 of those slides are really good examples of how you can really kind of enhance what you're talking about and make reference to it without using a lot of or any text or diagrams. You'll notice, like, Katie didn't choose to include something like a graph showing what 10% decrease looks like. She just described that as the state of Florida. And so there may be more slides available for the UC-wide competition, but we're sticking with 1 for the UC Davis competition. So when you're thinking about how to present your research and get it into kind of a really like compact, tight, compelling story like that, you want to ask yourself, first of all, how can you limit your presentation content so things are clear and understandable? I think oftentimes there's a big temptation to make your research talk kind of mirror the way you would talk with other specialists or mirror the way you would prepare a publication. But there's a lot of details in that story that aren't going to matter in the 3-minute talk where you're kind of trying to inspire people. So you only need to talk about your methods, for example, if that is the exciting part of your research. If you're looking at, let's say, using like more traditional methods to analyze a new problem, then you want to focus on the new problem and not on your use of kind of standard methods. You want to make sure that any like results and conclusions are frankly like exciting and compelling. And if they're not, then you want to explain why it's important to have confirmed or figured out what you did in your conclusions. You want to ask yourself how you can make your message more meaningful and memorable. And so this, again, it doesn't always have to be, this personal connection with the survival of the human race or the people in your audience, but you want to include things that are easy to remember and that have meaning for people. So you'll notice Katie used some kind of like light comedy at the beginning of her presentation. She also had kind of the posing at the end. These are all things that are easy to kind of grab onto and remember. Losing a crop the size of Florida is an idea that's easy to grab onto and remember. Things like, very detailed numbers can be less compelling and more difficult for your audience to remember. And then how will you relate the information to a specific audience? So Katie was working on, frankly, a much easier question, which is feeding the world. And so everyone eats, and so everyone is kind of natively interested in that. If your research only affects a smaller portion of people, or is only truly meaningful to a smaller portion of people, my recommendation is to think about your audience as having automatic empathy, which is to say, if your research matters to anyone, then you can make it matter to your audience because they care about the people who your research matters to. And so sometimes you'll have to do a little more work to draw that connection for them. As far as just like the nuts and bolts structuring of your talk, classic narrative structure that's recommended is part one, tell them what you're going to tell them. So kind of foreshadow what it is you're going to be talking about. Part two, tell them about your research, about what's exciting, meaningful, and interesting. And then part three, remind them about what you've just told them. Okay, return to that. Even though the talk is short, your audience is likely not going to be listening with an ear towards, doing their best to memorize everything that you say. And so this repetition is going to be really important. I think one thing that you'll notice is this structure that we're recommending is not introduce yourself and the department that you're from and your advisor's name and your history of publications. Tell them about your hypothesis, tell them about your methods, tell them about your conclusion. That's the wrong kind of organizational layout that you're looking at for this type of talk. Okay, that might be a really good way to structure a job talk in your field, or a poster or paper that you're preparing. But for this kind of audience, what you want to be really looking at is just kind of like reflecting one really core message in these three parts. And so you can also think of the funnel model for research communication, which starts with using examples that are interesting and relevant for the audience. And I find oftentimes a lot of people kind of have a small hang up here where they're like, well, I don't want to use this analogy or use this example because it's not technically 100% accurate to the work that I'm doing on. If I want to use an analogy about about how traffic is similar to the way this molecule moves in the bloodstream. It's like, well, traffic doesn't work exactly that way, so I don't want to use that analogy. But you need to find some way to latch on to what your audience already knows. And so if they're not an expert in your area, again, you can use imperfect examples, use imperfect analogies just to get them started, and then highlight the points of mismatch later on in part two when you talk about your research. That's where you can get back to being really precise about what you're doing. And then in part three, return back to those initial examples or analogies that you used to, again, kind of solidify the new information you've given your audience. Okay, again, help them attach it to things that they already understand and help them take that kind of cognitive shortcut. In order to get this done in 3 minutes, you don't have a lot of room to kind of ramble around, make digressions, introduce a lot of qualifications. And so I think there's also an element of this of figuring out what is the shortest line from A to B, what is the shortest story you can tell that makes your research compelling and interesting and important? And leave out everything else you're doing and everything else that you're thinking about that isn't absolutely necessary for that story. You'll notice the judging criterion didn't include a criteria of whether or not you explained all of your research. Okay, you get to pick and choose. You get to choose what aspect of what you're working on you want to share with everyone. So it's not going to be absolutely necessary that you mention the literature review you're doing or all the hypotheses that you've discarded at this point and are no longer pursuing, or even the reasons why necessarily that you chose the research to focus on that you are focusing on. All right, and now some advice on the visuals. Number one, I would say use a white background. Oftentimes, there's a strong temptation to use a stylized or colored background for the sake of being different or standing out in that way. As I say with many things, you only want to stand out with the thing you want people to remember. So if you use a different background or different like exciting styling because you think that'll be attention grabbing, it will, but it will pull attention away from the content of your talk. If you are remembered as the person with the, bright magenta background, you're not being remembered as the person with the exciting research, okay, or the really clear, organized talk and engaging presentation style. I would say choose a standard legible font. I'm not great at knowing the names of different fonts. That's not something I've poured a lot of time into, but I would say Arial, Times New Roman, Helvetica. These are all pretty commonly used, easy to read fonts. Don't get too crazy with it. Use clean, simple graphics and diagrams. No, again, and the same note with like different colored backgrounds, the human eye is just drawn to things like numbers, okay? And especially if you, numbers, symbols, if you use a visual that gives someone something to figure out, okay, presented as a puzzle, or they want to see whether, this acts matches another one or anything like that. Again, that's going to be drawing attention away from what you really want people to focus on, which is your presentation, the content of your research, and your engagement style. So the more a graphic is clean, simple, and easy to kind of glance at, understand, and then return their attention to you, that's going to be the best visual aid you can provide. Along those notes, use as little text as possible, maybe none at all, because as soon as you put text up on the screen, people are going to start reading it. And if you have a lot of text on the screen, that can end up being a significant period of time where your audience's attention is either split or even they might even be ignoring you in order to do the reading. So I would say be really careful about putting text on the screen for your short talk. So here is an example of 2 slides for Katie Murphy's talk, and you'll notice, the one on the left, it's not easy to glance at. It's not easy to intelligent what is going on there. I know for me, the first thing that goes on is like, what is HHB 67-2, and can I figure out what that is or what that means or what that's called? It's going to take me, I don't know, 20 seconds to read all of that text. Whereas on the right side, I can glance on that and say, we're talking about making corn stronger, and now I'm done and I can get right back to the talk. I can get back to engaging with the speaker. All right, so general tips. Start by making the topic relevant to your audience. And I would really encourage you to start here in your talk. Anything you introduce before the audience feels like the topic is relevant is likely to be lost, is likely to be wasted time. You need to get them attached right away. simplify your language and eliminate jargon. I would say one big piece of advice I like to give here is that only eliminate jargon when there's an alternative. If you have to use jargon, that's perfectly fine. Just define it for your audience. And it has to be definable in very simple language as well. But your audience can definitely handle learning a new word or two. Adopt a consistent style and format. This again is kind of on the note of distraction and pulling people away from what you want them to remember. If you have inconsistencies in your style and format of presentation, they're probably going to be remembering that a lot more than the content of your presentation. Along the same lines, be careful about using color, imagery, and text. These all pull information, these all pull attention away. And remember, you want people to be looking at you for as much of the 3 minutes as possible, not at your slides. Some tips for the qualifying round, since you're going to be recording. Number one, I would just say, pay attention to visual details in your video the same way you would pay attention to the visual details in your slides. So this includes the way you're dressed. In previous years, we've seen things like people wearing a shirt that blends in with the drapes, or is, you know, the same tone as the wall behind them, and that can be really distracting. Some patterns can make you look like you have, you know, a really large head or a really small head, or anything like kind of distracting like that. Just, you know, take a look at the video in advance, and be conscious about how the colors can be really distracting. You know, I'm not going to suggest, like, you don't have to wear any particular color. It's more about like the match between the color that you're wearing and what is visible in the background. I'd say be careful about lighting as well. Try to avoid being backlit, because that will wash out your face and reduce all of your facial expressions, which is one of the most engaging parts of your speech. And remove background objects that you don't want on camera. This is, if possible, just like remove things from your background that are too interesting to look at. Okay, so there's nothing wrong, you know, pillow, couch, other stuff, that's fine. But if you have like a really interesting piece of art in the background, you might want to pull it off the wall for the recording again, so it doesn't distract people and pull attention away from you. A lot of people have tried using Zoom backgrounds in the past. I'm going to say I generally recommend against it. It tends to wash out your facial and hand gestures. And it's also, from the people who have tried it, I've heard it is incredibly challenging to get the Zoom background to put the imagery where you actually want it to be. So I would generally recommend against that unless you're really, really confident that you've got it figured out. If possible, I recommend recording yourself standing rather than sitting. It gives you a lot more ability to make engaging gestures, and also helps you project a lot more. I'm talking sitting now, and I'm already definitely feeling the pressure on my chest. Also, if you're standing and can get a little distance to get kind of more of your upper body in frame, that will be more engaging. And along those notes, if you want your gestures to be visual to your audience, you're going to have to make them a little more exaggerated on video than you would in person, because you're not going to have, you know, head to toe full body coverage in your video. So you're going to need your upper body to do more of the gestural work. All right, so I'm going to pause here again for any questions. Again, feel free to unmute, raise hand, enter them in chat about any of these tips or any other advice that people are looking for. All right, I can hear the virtual crickets. So next steps, go to grad.ucdavis.edu/gradslam to sign up for the competition. You can find lots of Grad Slam presentations on YouTube for reference and inspiration. I would say for the most part, don't try to just like perfectly mirror someone else's structure, because that is probably fine-tuned to their research and their presentation style, but it can be a great way to kind of get started and get inspired. Definitely go to the Grad Pathways website for more preparatory workshops. It's at gradpathways.ucdavis.edu. And if you have any questions about the competition, about when it comes to the final round, permissibility of props, things like that, please email Catherine Rayleigh, who is in the chat right now, our program and advanced manager, at knrayleigh@ucdavis.edu. And yeah, if there are no other questions, that is our info session for today. I want to thank everyone for joining me, and good luck in this year's competition.